In the wake of 34 felony convictions in his New York election interference trial, Donald Trump seems to be set on one thing: revenge. In several interviews this week, Trump has suggested that he would be interested in prosecuting his political enemies if he is elected president again. And Republican lawmakers appear to be in lockstep with their cult leader, even subpoenaing Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg to testify before Congress about the trial. So when millions of Americans head to the polls focused on issues important to them, it appears Trump, more than ever, will be focused only on his favorite issue: himself. Joining me now is Susan Del Percio, Republican strategist and MSNBC political analyst, and Danielle Moody, host of the Woke AF Daily podcast and co-host of the Daily Beast's New Abnormal and the Democracy-ish podcast. Ladies, always so good to have you here. Susan, I'm going to start with you. You've got a great new piece for MSNBC Online where you say that Trump is not just saying these things to excite his base and raise money. He believes in retribution, and this retribution has become central to his base. Look, talking revenge may work for his base, but how effective a message is that as a platform for attracting other voters?
Well, what's interesting, Katie, and thank you for highlighting the piece, is that we're in June right now. It's still early. I am willing to bet that Biden gets his base back, and we are going to continue to see close polls, which means this race will probably once again come down to suburban women. And the one thing that we saw from 2020 was they don't like a bully. They don't like people who bully other people. And that is what Donald Trump will come across if he continues down this vein, which I think he will. I mean, let's face it, Katie, the reason why Donald Trump ran for 2024 is because he wanted to stay out of jail and he wanted to take revenge against other people. So I think that's absolutely the way it's going to go. But when it comes to swing voters, I do think it's going to backfire on them.
Danielle, I'm big on not following polls. It's always the stakes, not the odds. But I did find something interesting in an ABC News Ipsos poll that came out this week that found that 52% of independents that were polled, and this group called double haters, people that have an unfavorable view of both Trump and President Biden, they felt that Trump should drop out of the 2024 presidential race, given, Danielle, that is unlikely to happen. What could that mean, though, for Trump coming into November?
Look, I'm with you when it comes to polls, particularly this far out, that I don't necessarily pay attention to them. I think that they're like paying attention to the weather. You know how to dress, right? And I think that what we understand right now is that, you know, Donald Trump and his rhetoric, as Susan was saying, is resonating with his base, and it is resonating with his donors, right, who continue to open up their coffers. But when it comes to independence, and I think that when it comes to women and people with uteruses that understand and see what is happening state by state with a rollback of their rights and their protections, I think that they look at the larger picture and they say, what does Trump's retribution have to do with me, right? How am I going to deal and how am I going to teach my daughter and my daughter's daughter about the fact that they have no control over their bodies, which means that they have no control over their futures? I think that the more that Democrats can focus the attention of the electorate on the policies and not just the rhetoric that comes out of Donald Trump's mouth, then we will see that the Republican Party is set on a 19th century America, and people need to wake up to that.
You know, Susan, along that vein, we're hearing that Trump is starting to narrow down his search for a running mate, with several candidates reportedly being vetted recently. Sources telling NBC News that 4 of the top prospects right now are North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum, who I have to be reminded who he is all the time, Senators Marco Rubio of Florida, Tim Scott of South Carolina, and J.D. Vance of Ohio. I'm going to add my own personal footnote. Very notably, none of them being women, talking about people that don't have a uterus. So beyond being loyal to Donald Trump, do any of these people, Susan, bring anything to the table of value that would attract a non-MAGA Republican or even an independent?
Absolutely not. As a matter of fact, they will probably be turning away potential independents or center-right independents, I should say. And there's no doubt about it. The only thing Donald Trump is looking for in a running mate is someone who will just fall in line. He thinks by picking an African-American man or a Hispanic man may help him with those communities. It will not. And what's interesting about Scott and Rubio is they also have a base that they can talk to. They both have run for president. Donald Trump doesn't like that. That's why I think the North Dakota governor is someone who no one knows and has no platform, is probably someone Donald Trump really likes. The only question is how much money does he have, and can Trump be a little envious of that?
Danielle, I want to stay on this topic because I think it's a really important one. We've seen what Donald Trump does to the Mother May I Michael Pences of the world, putting aside him almost being hanged because he's Trump's vice president. Susan brings up such good points, right? If these potential VP picks don't bring anything of quality to the table, in fact, they alienate potential voters, then of those four, do you think that any of them actually have a better chance? Again, Doug Burgum, again, I always have to be reminded who he is.
I mean, in all honesty, we have to understand that Donald Trump does not care about what is best for the country. He cares about having a flacky. And so you have to, and having somebody who is going to be his yes man. He needs somebody that if, in fact, right, you know, you're put back in a 2020 position in the way that Mike Pence was, that you're going to look at Donald Trump and look away from the Constitution. He needs people that are 100% drinking the Kool-Aid, a part of his cult, and also do not take away the shine from him. That is also incredibly important. So you're not going to see a Nikki Haley or a Kristen Noem or any of those people that are there because they have their own shine. For you having to remind yourself about Doug Burgum, you know, the thing is, he fits the bill. No one really knows him. He kind of looks the part that Donald Trump really likes. He's got a head of hair on him, you know, and he's rich. Like, that's what Donald Trump wants in his corner, and somebody that will say yes. So we have to see that what we look for in a vice president as Americans and as voters is not what Donald Trump is looking for.
And Susan, I got less than a minute, but I did want to, again, stay on this. I think this is a really important point because I think people do pay attention to your VP pick. I mean, we've heard how amazing, and I agree that Vice President Kamala Harris, what she brings to the table, her uniqueness, her intelligence, her life skills. And when you look at the options that are available to Donald Trump, I've talked about his buffet of criminality, but in this instance, it's a buffet of nothingness. I mean, there is really nothing there. And so it's really the idea of picking somebody that Donald Trump can mold into something that he wants them to be.
Absolutely, because he doesn't want a vice president who brings something to the table. And he certainly doesn't have one who has a platform or their own agenda. When you look at Vice President Harris, she brought a lot, and not just because she was a woman and a person of color, but she balanced out the ticket. It made sense when you looked at Joe Biden's candidacy. Anyone who has a brain probably won't agree to be Donald Trump's VP choice, but this is anyone who agrees. It's all about straight ambition.
I now amend my statement. It's a buffet of boring. Okay, thank you guys, Danielle Moody and Susan Del Percio, for being here. I always appreciate your insight and analysis.